I want to say that I knew from the first ping. I want to say that because it would make the whole thing feel less random, less like something that happened to me the way weather happens to a coast, indifferently, without malice, without any recognition that I was standing there watching. But the truth is that on the morning the IHS Ardent Whisper crossed into Quorum Station 9's primary detection band, I logged it the same way I logged everything that watch, competently, by the archive, without a second thought. The archive said it was a Terran civilian heavy freighter, Class IV designation, registered out of the Karath Transit Hub, last confirmed passage through a Quorum sensor relay approximately 11 standard months prior. The archive said its drives produced a particular thermal signature, its hull had a particular mass profile, and its cargo manifest, filed with the Karath Hub on departure, listed processed biological substrate, grain, essentially, by any other name, bound for the Turthan colonies in the outer arm. The archive said it was not armed. The archive said it was, by every meaningful metric, unremarkable. I was 23 standard years old. I had been assigned to Quorum Station 9 for 8 months. I was on my second tour of signals service, which meant I had seen enough contact logs to know the pattern. Terran civilian traffic was dull, reliable, and almost neurotically predictable. They filed their manifests, they flew their lanes, they responded to standard hails within 40 seconds of receipt. They were, as the Quorum commander Vesthal often said during briefings, among the most thoroughly filed species in the known galaxy. That was not a compliment exactly. It wasn't an insult either. It was the Quorum exact's version of a compliment, which is to say it was a statement of fact delivered with the satisfaction of a perfectly completed record. The Quorum exact derived something close to pleasure from a complete record. I was young enough then to share in that satisfaction without examining it too closely. The station itself contributed to that feeling, to that settled, recursive comfort of the known world. Quorum Station 9 was built 40 years ago as a transit hub and administrative relay for the outer arm sectors, and in 40 years it had accumulated exactly the architecture of an institution that knows what it is doing. Every corridor had the quiet efficiency of a place where things were handled correctly and filed promptly, and reviewed on schedule. The signals division occupied the 4th tier, and from my station I could see 3 different readout panels, 2 passive scan displays, 1 active scan array, and the long transparent observation panel that looked out into the docking approach zone. Orderly. Cataloged. There was a satisfaction in working in a place that looked the way it was supposed to look. I filed my morning reports at 600, recalibrated the secondary passive array as per the weekly maintenance schedule. It was fine. It was always fine. I had calibrated it 4 times and it had always been fine. And at 6:14, the IHS Ardent Whisper appeared on the primary detection screen. I pulled its archive entry and read it the way I read every archive entry, completely, efficiently, without skepticism, because skepticism without cause is not a Quorum exact virtue. The entry was correct. The entry had been filed at Karath Hub by an intake officer named Seth Sorrell, 18 years of service, perfect record, no anomalous flags in her entire career. The entry matched the contact trace perfectly, every field aligned. I sent the standard arrival hail and went back to my morning reports. 40 seconds, then 60, then 2 minutes. I sent the hail again, using the civilian band, then the emergency band, then the old broadwave band that Terran vessels almost never monitored anymore. A legacy frequency that was still in the hail protocol because the protocol was last updated 11 years ago, and nobody had yet filed the paperwork to remove it. Nothing returned. I flagged the contact for Commander Vesthal. He came to my station the way he always came when I flagged something, slowly, without urgency, with the particular deliberate patience that senior Quorum officers wore the way others wore uniforms. Vesthal was 47 years old and had served on 4 stations. He had never in his career seen anything that the archive did not already hold. This was not unusual. Most Quorum officers of his rank could say the same thing, because the archive was very good, and the known galaxy was, by and large, the known galaxy. He looked at my screen. He looked at the contact trace. He looked at the archive cross-reference I had pulled, and his eyes moved across it with the swift efficiency of someone reading a document he has essentially already memorized. "Class IV Terran civilian heavy freighter," he said. "Yes, Commander." Non-responsive to standard hails. 3 attempts all bands. He made a small sound, not dismissal exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Their communication arrays degrade," he said. "The Class IV series was built with a suboptimal antenna housing. We see this contact type drop to passive receive approximately once every 11 transit cycles. They're receiving our hails. They simply can't reply until they bring the array back online manually, which requires the communications officer to physically access a maintenance compartment on Deck 4. He paused. "It takes between 30 and 40 minutes, depending on the officer's familiarity with the compartment." I had not known that. It was, I realized, in the archive, in a subcategory 3 levels below the primary Class IV entry, filed under maintenance protocols and engineering notes for Terran civilian vessel classes. I had not gone 3 levels deep. Vesthal had. Or more likely, he had simply been told this fact by a signals officer 11 years ago on a different station, and it had sat in his memory since then, perfectly preserved, waiting to be exactly correct. "I'll note it in the log," I said. "Note it," he agreed, and returned to his chair. The IHS Ardent Whisper continued on its heading, inbound toward the station's outer processing zone, where Terran civilian traffic was required to decelerate to approach velocity and await a docking assignment from station traffic control. This was routine. This was so routine that the traffic control officer, a third-tour senior named Pethsaz, was already preparing the standard docking assignment before I had even resolved the hail issue in my log. Pethsaz had been at traffic control for 9 years. He had processed several thousand Terran civilian contacts. He was entirely untroubled. I watched the contact trace. The Ardent Whisper did not decelerate. At 6:41, when a vessel on a standard civilian approach should have begun its deceleration burn, the drive signature simply continued at transit velocity, not accelerating, not decelerating, moving the way a ship moves when it has somewhere to be and has decided that approach protocols are someone else's concern. I flagged it again. Vesthal came back more slowly this time. "Still non-responsive," I said, "and no deceleration burn at the approach waypoint." He looked at the trace. His eyes were very still. "The Quorum exact are not a species that telegraphs uncertainty. Our faces are not built for it the way, say, a Turthan face is built for it. But I had been watching Commander Vesthal for 8 months, and I knew the particular quality of stillness that meant he was running a calculation. They may have a navigation fault in addition to the communications fault," he said. "Class IV series also has a documented issue with the approach protocol subroutine when the navigation system is running a degraded array. The ship will maintain transit velocity until the subroutine is manually reset." "Also on Deck 4, I asked. He looked at me, and I was not sure whether I had been impertinent or accurate, probably both. "Adjacent compartment," he said. "The documentation is in the archive." "Yes, Commander." I watched the trace. The IHS Ardent Whisper crossed the outer processing waypoint at 6:49 without decelerating. It was now inside the station's primary traffic zone. Any Terran civilian vessel, any vessel, by the common protocol of every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, would have recognized what it had just done. It had crossed a marked boundary. It was now, technically, in violation of approach protocol, and it was still moving at transit velocity, and it was still not responding to hails. Pethsaz at traffic control sent a formal deviation alert to the vessel and copied me on it. I logged the copy. I pulled up the deep scan module and ran a passive diagnostic on the contact, a standard practice when a vessel deviated from expected behavior, just to confirm the archive entry matched what the sensors were actually reading. I had run this diagnostic dozens of times. It had always confirmed the archive. There was a particular, almost meditative quality to running an instrument check and having it return exactly what you expected, the reassurance of the calibrated world. I ran the diagnostic and looked at the results. Then I ran it again. The mass profile was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not instrument error wrong. The IHS Ardent Whispers hull mass, according to the archive entry, was 14,000 standard metric tons, consistent with a Class IV Terran civilian heavy freighter carrying a full complement of processed biological substrate. The deep scan read 47,000 metric tons. I sat with that number for approximately 4 seconds. Then I pulled the drive signature data. The thermal profile in the archive, a standard Class IV civilian drive, rated at 0.4 standard thrust units. The deep scan thermal profile, 2.1 standard thrust units, which was not a civilian rating. That was not close to a civilian rating. A Class IV civilian drive at 2.1 thrust units would have shaken itself apart inside 8 seconds of sustained operation. The hull I was watching had been running at 2.1 thrust units for, based on the entry point and speed, approximately 9 hours. I sat very still. I was trained to sit still in moments like this, not because the Quorum Exact trains calmness as a technique, but because stillness is what happens when a mind built for the archive encounters a thing the archive says cannot exist and cannot yet process the distance between the two. I flagged it for Commander Vesthal, and this time I did not wait for him to come to me. I went to him. He read the deep scan data without moving. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, completely, with the focused precision that the Quorum Exact brought to the act of reading the same way other species bring breathing to the act of living. When he finished, he pulled up the archive entry and read that too. The deep scan array on this station is 14 years old, he said. It was recalibrated 11 weeks ago, I said. I processed the recalibration certification myself. A pause. The contact is occluded by the Heron debris field, he said, gesturing toward the projection of the approach lane. Occluded contacts produce mass-reading anomalies. The debris field introduces scatter in the scan return. I pulled up the approach lane projection and overlaid the Heron debris field. The IHS Ardent Whispers approach track did not pass through the Heron debris field. It passed through a completely unoccluded sector of space. There was nothing between our deep scan array and the hull of that vessel, except approximately 340,000 kilometers of very clean vacuum. I showed this to Commander Vesthal. He looked at it. He looked at the deep scan data again. And I watched something happen on his face that I had never seen before in 8 months of watching Commander Vesthal's face. Something that the Quorum Exact are not supposed to be particularly susceptible to, because we are a civilization built on the completeness of the archive, on the understanding that what is known is what exists, and what exists has been known. And the recursive comfort of that equation is supposed to leave very little room for what I was now watching move across the face of a 47-year-old signals commander who had spent his entire career reading from the archive and finding the world exactly where the archive said it would be. He was uncertain. Not panicked, not afraid. Just uncertain in the way a very precise instrument is uncertain when it is handed a measurement that falls outside its calibrated range, a kind of very controlled, very quiet not knowing. It was, I realized later, the most honest thing I had ever seen him do. "I'm going to transmit to Fleet Command," he said. "Yes, Commander." "Route at priority." Already routing. He sat back down. I went back to my station. At 7:03, the IHS Ardent Whisper crossed the inner approach threshold. The second marked boundary, the one that activated the station's automated defense alert, the one that under normal circumstances no vessel ever crossed without explicit docking clearance, because the automated alert, once triggered, required a commander's authorization to stand down and generated an incident report that went to 3 levels of Quorum administrative oversight. The automated alert activated. Vestal authorized the stand down within 40 seconds, which was the correct response to a civilian vessel with documented equipment failure that posed no weapons threat and had a perfectly valid archive classification. He was following protocol. He was doing exactly what the archive and the protocol and 47 years of common sense told him to do with a Class IV Terran civilian heavy freighter that had bad antenna housing and a glitching navigation subroutine. I ran the deep scan again. 47,000 metric tons, 2.1 thrust units, and now, with the vessel much closer and the scan resolution correspondingly higher, something I hadn't been able to resolve from farther out, the hull surface. A Class IV Terran civilian heavy freighter has a hull surface composed of commercial-grade carbon composite plating. It is not particularly thick. It is not particularly hard. It is the hull of a vessel whose designers were thinking about cost and cargo capacity and maintenance cycles, not about what happens when things hit it at high relative velocity. It is, to be precise about it, a hull that the archive classifies as offering protection against microdebris impacts and minor radiation events and nothing else. The hull I was looking at was not commercial-grade carbon composite. I had never seen a Terran military hull in person. I had seen images in the archive, cross-section analyses, materials assessments, the standard intelligence briefings that every signals officer received and most never needed. I had seen enough to know what the archive said such a hull looked like under deep scan. I was looking at it now. Whatever the IHS Ardent Whisper actually was, its outer hull was 2.3 meters of layered reactive armor, the kind the archive described as capable of absorbing a direct hit from a Quorum fleet-grade munition without losing structural integrity. The kind of hull that was not on any civilian vessel in the archive of any species we had ever catalogued. The kind of hull that meant that every hail we had sent, every protocol we had invoked, every marking on every boundary it had crossed, had bounced off that surface not because the communications array was degraded, and not because the navigation subroutine was glitching. It had bounced off because no one inside that hull had felt the need to respond. I called Commander Vestal again. This time I didn't go to him. This time I transmitted to his station directly on the command channel, which I had never done in 8 months, and which I had been told in training was appropriate in exactly 2 situations: a medical emergency involving a senior officer, or a sensor contact that constituted a threat to the station. "Commander," I said, "the hull is military, the mass is military, the drive output is military. Whatever the archive says this vessel is, that is not what is on my screen." A pause that lasted longer than it should have. "Isilvo," he said, and his voice had a quality I had not heard from him before. "What you're describing is a vessel that has been in our archive for 11 months. A vessel that has passed through 2 Quorum sensor relays on its way here without raising a flag at either relay, because the archive matched. If the archive matched twice before, and the classification was entered after a proper sensor reading at Karath Hub, then whoever entered the classification at Karath Hub made an error," I said. Another pause. "The Karath Hub intake officer has a perfect record," he said, 18 years. "Then whoever gave the ship its transponder classification made an error," I said. And here is what I meant, though I did not have the words for it yet. standing there at my station watching a 47,000 metric ton military hull slide through our inner approach threshold at transit velocity, while Commander Vesthal processed the implications of an 18-year perfect record. The archive was not wrong about what had been filed. The archive held exactly what had been filed. But the thing that had been filed, the entry, the classification, the mass profile and drive signature and cargo manifest that had passed 2 sensor relays and lived in our system for 11 months, was not a description of the vessel that was now 280,000 kilometers from Quorum Station 9. It was a description of what someone had wanted us to believe the vessel was. And the vessel had cooperated with that belief for 11 months, running at civilian speed through civilian lanes, carrying civilian transponder codes, doing absolutely nothing that would cause a signals officer at any of the relay points along its route to pull up a deep scan and look past the surface. It had been, and I want to be precise here, because the word matters, polite. "Commander," I said, "I think someone filed it wrong on purpose." The channel was quiet for a full 4 seconds. That was long enough to tell me everything about what the commander was running through his mind. The implications, the administrative consequences, the record of 2 clean relay station passes, the 18-year intake officer, all of it colliding with the number on my screen. "Send the deep scan to Fleet Command. Full data package, priority." "Already sent." "Good, a breath. Get me a vector projection. Where is it going if it holds this heading?" I ran the vector. The IHS Ardent Whisper, on its current heading at current velocity, was going to pass through the station's central docking zone. Not into a docking bay. Through the central zone, through the space that the docking bays opened onto, the space that no vessel traveled at transit velocity because at transit velocity in the central zone, a 47,000 metric ton object would pass through our docking infrastructure the way a stone passes through still water. "It's going to pass through the station," I said. "Not if the fleet intercepts." I looked at my screen. Quorum fleet elements stationed at the 9 anchor point, 7th Enforcement Squadron, 12 vessels, the standard complement for a station of our class, were already beginning to move. Vesthal had been talking to Fleet Control while he was talking to me. The 7th Enforcement Squadron was built around 3 medium interdiction hulls and 9 fast-response patrol vessels. They were, for a Terran civilian heavy freighter with equipment failures, an overwhelming response. They were capable of stopping any traffic violation we had ever been called upon to manage. I had read their capability assessments in the archive the same way I had read everything else. Completely, efficiently, without any sense that the numbers would ever matter personally. I ran their mass data and their weapons ratings while I watched them form up, and then I checked the archive entry for the Ardent Whisper's recorded armament. The archive said, "None, Class IV civilian, no weapons mounted." I watched the Ardent Whisper. It was 260,000 kilometers out now, and at this resolution the deep scan was giving me surface detail I hadn't had before. Not images. The deep scan doesn't produce images. It produces structural density maps, but enough to read hull geometry. The hull geometry I was reading had protrusions that were not cargo loading infrastructure, were not antenna housings, were not the standard external equipment of any civilian vessel in the archive. They were weapons ports. I counted 47 distinct weapons port signatures before I stopped counting, because counting more felt, at that moment, like exactly the wrong use of the time I had left. I transmitted the structural data to Vesthal, and then, because the priority message to Fleet Command hadn't carried the hull geometry data, I transmitted it directly to Fleet Command as well, on my own authority, which was not something a second tour signals officer was supposed to do without a commander's authorization. I noted this in the log. I believed at the time that the log notation was sufficient to protect me administratively if the transmission turned out to be unnecessary. I want to be honest about the fact that I was still thinking about administrative protection, even then. even with 47 weapons ports on my screen, and a 47,000 metric ton hull running at military thrust through our inner approach zone, with complete disregard for everything we had asked of it. I was still, somewhere in the part of me that had filed those recalibration certifications, and maintained those log notations, and learned the 3 levels deep subcategories of Class IV maintenance protocols, thinking about the record. The quorum exact, we are what we are. At 7:31, the 7th Enforcement Squadron completed its intercept formation at a distance of 180,000 kilometers from the Ardent Whisper's projected track. 12 vessels arranged in a standard interdiction screen, blocking the heading. It was a good formation. I had seen it in training materials. It was designed to stop anything up to a medium Quorum warship, which was the largest class of vessel we expected to deal with in enforcement actions. The middle interdiction hulls were at the center of the screen, flanked by the patrol vessels, with a clear fire corridor toward the contact. I watched the formation solidify and felt something that I can only describe as misplaced confidence. Not my own confidence, but the confidence of the protocol, the confidence of the 12-vessel interdiction formation that had worked correctly every time it had been deployed, that had a doctrinal record and an operational history and an archive entry that confirmed it was exactly the right response to exactly this situation. The formation was correct. The protocol was correct. The formation would work because the formation always worked, and the training materials said it would work, and the archive had never been wrong. Fleet Commander Othdorev, commanding the 7th, hailed the Ardent Whisper on every available channel simultaneously. No response. He hailed it again, this time with the formal warning protocol, the one that specifies, in the common language and in 3 secondary languages including Standard Terran, that the vessel in question is directed to reduce speed and alter heading or face interdiction action. No response. The Ardent Whisper did not reduce speed. It did not alter heading. It continued on its vector toward the 7th Enforcement Squadron's interdiction screen at 2.1 thrust units of drive output from a hull that was not a civilian vessel, and had never been a civilian vessel, and had been filed as a civilian vessel in our archive 11 months ago by an intake officer with an 18-year perfect record, who was going to have to spend a significant amount of time explaining this to Quorum administrative oversight. Assuming there was a Quorum administrative oversight process left to explain it to. I watched it close the distance to the 7th. 180,000 kilometers, 160,000, 140,000. At 120,000 kilometers, Fleet Commander Othdorev transmitted his authorization for interdiction action, and the 3 medium interdiction hulls opened fire. The Ardent Whisper's hull lit up on my deep scan. The impacts were registering, the energy signatures of the interdiction weapons making contact with that 2.3-meter reactive armor were unmistakable, and I watched the damage assessment data come back from the scan with the focused attention of someone who has been trained to read damage assessment data, and who was now reading it, and finding that what the scan was returning did not match what the training materials said damage assessment data should look like. The reactive armor was doing what reactive armor does. It was absorbing the impacts, not deflecting them, absorbing them. The hull was taking hits from 3 medium interdiction hulls at standard fire rate, and the structural density map was not changing in any meaningful way. The numbers were as calm as the day I had calibrated the array. They simply did not move. The Ardent Whisper had not fired back. That was the thing I kept returning to in the seconds that followed. It had not fired back. It had 47 weapons ports, and it was being hit by 3 interdiction hulls, and it had not responded. It continued on its heading. It continued at 2.1 thrust units. It crossed 100,000 kilometers from the 7th Enforcement Squadron's interdiction screen, as if the 3 hulls firing at it were producing a minor nuisance, perhaps a vibration in the hull plating, perhaps a slight harmonic in the drive systems, certainly nothing that merited changing course. The patrol vessels opened fire as well, adding 9 additional weapon streams to the 3 already running. All 12 vessels of the 7th Enforcement Squadron were now firing on the Ardent Whisper simultaneously. The combined output was significant. On paper, on the capability assessment I had read in the archive, this was more firepower than had been brought to bear on a single contact in the outer sectors in 16 years. It did not fire back. It crossed 80,000 kilometers, 60,000. At 40,000 kilometers, Fleet Commander Othdorev ordered the interdiction screen to disperse. This was correct. This was exactly what you do when a vessel is not stopping, and you have confirmed through your own weapon's fire that you cannot stop it from the front, and it is now close enough that staying in its path is a commitment to a collision you cannot win. The 7th Enforcement Squadron broke formation, and the 12 vessels peeled away to either side, and the Ardent Whisper passed through the space where the interdiction screen had been, as if it had always known the screen would move. It had taken no visible damage. I pulled up the weapons port data again. 47 ports, still closed, every one of them. The Ardent Whisper was holding its fire. I want you to understand what that meant, and I want to be honest about the fact that it took me several seconds to understand it myself, because the understanding required me to take the thing I knew, that this vessel had spent 11 months being polite, running civilian lanes at civilian speeds, filing civilian manifests, presenting civilian transponder codes, and connect it to the thing I was now seeing, which was that it was still being polite. The weapons ports were closed. The hull had absorbed 12 vessels worth of weapons fire, and the weapons ports were still closed. It wasn't retaliating, it was continuing. There is a category of action in Quorum tactical doctrine that is described as demonstrative approach, the maneuver a significantly superior force makes when it wants to communicate something without engaging in full combat. You do not destroy the listening post, you pass through its defense screen. You do not sink the patrol vessels, you let them fire on you and you absorb it and you keep moving. You are not fighting, you are delivering a message. The message is, this is what I am. I was 23 years old and I had been a signals officer for 2 tours, and I had logged contacts and read archives and recalibrated deep scan arrays. And I was sitting at my station at 7:41 station time, watching a vessel. I had logged as harmless pass through our entire defense capability without firing a single weapon. And somewhere below my training and my administrative instincts and my habitual comfort with the perfect record, something was opening that I had not known was there. A space of pure unfiled recognition. A place in the mind that is older than archives and does not require classification, that simply looks and sees and knows. I was afraid. Not of the Ardent Whisper, specifically. Afraid of the thing the Ardent Whisper was making clear. Afraid in the way you are afraid when you pull a perfect file, and the file turns out to describe something entirely different from what is in front of you. And the terror is not in the thing itself, but in the discovery that the file was always wrong and you had never noticed, and every other file might also be wrong, and the comfort of the complete record was not, perhaps, the same thing as the comfort of the correct record. I pulled up the long-range scan and pushed the range out, far out, past the Heron debris field, past the outer sensor pickets, out to the edge of our passive detection range, which at full sensitivity was approximately 2.8 million kilometers. I pushed the sensitivity to maximum and ran the scan. The results came back in sections, the way long-range passive results always do, building from the outermost range inward. Empty space. The debris field signature, 3 Quorum relay buoys, the station's own drive wake. And then, at approximately 2.3 million kilometers, a return that I had to recalibrate for, because my first read of it was that the array was malfunctioning, that something in the passive detection system had developed a fault that was causing it to return a mass signature so large, so broad, so thoroughly blanketing the scan range that the instrument must be wrong. I ran the self-diagnostic. The array was functioning correctly. I expanded the scan aperture. The return expanded with it. It was not a malfunction, it was a fleet. But fleet is a small word for what the passive scan was showing me, and I want to be careful here about accuracy, because what I logged in the next 90 seconds, what I transmitted to Fleet Command, what I transmitted in this broadcast, what is recorded in the station's log archive, needs to be accurate. The Quorum exact are nothing if not accurate. The long-range passive scan at 2.3 million kilometers was returning heat signatures, drive emissions, and hull mass profiles consistent with approximately. And I want to be precise about the word approximately, because the scan resolution at that range does not support exact counts, and I am a signals officer, and I will not fabricate precision. I do not have approximately 900 individual vessels. 900. Ranging in class from what the scan was resolving as medium-weight hull signatures up to profiles that had no corresponding entry in the archive, because the archive did not contain a classification for hull mass readings above 140,000 metric tons, and several of the profiles I was looking at were reading above 140,000 metric tons. The archive entry for the largest Terran military vessel we had ever cataloged listed a hull mass of 88,000 metric tons. That entry had been filed 9 years ago, and I had read it precisely once, during a standard intelligence briefing, and it had seemed abstract and distant, and not particularly relevant to the work of a signals officer on a transit and administrative station in the outer sectors. They had not moved yet. 900 vessels at 2.3 million kilometers holding position, not advancing, not powering weapons, not transmitting on any band, simply sitting there in the dark at the edge of my passive scan range, having been there long enough, given the drive emission decay signatures, to have arrived sometime in the last 6 to 8 hours, while I was sleeping, while I was reviewing the morning archive logs, while the IHS Ardent Whisper was being polite in civilian transit lanes, responding to no hails and crossing every boundary we offered, and absorbing everything the 7th Enforcement Squadron fired into its hull. While we were waiting for it to respond, I sat very still for a moment. And then I did what a signals officer does. I logged it, I dated it, I timestamped it. I attached the full scan dataset. And I began to transmit, because the station was still transmitting, the power was still on, the antenna array was still operating, and I had a record to make and a report to file. 7:48 station time. This is Signals Officer Issel Vo, second tour, Quorum Station 9. I am transmitting this log on emergency priority to all available Fleet Command channels and to the Quorum Administrative Bureau relay at Sector 11. I am attaching full sensor data. At 6:14 this morning, I logged a contact designated IHS Ardent Whisper, classified in our archive as a Terran civilian heavy freighter, Class IV. At 6:49, the vessel crossed our outer approach waypoint without decelerating and without responding to hails. At 7:03, the vessel crossed the inner approach threshold, triggering an automated defense alert. Deep scan analysis of the vessel revealed hull mass of 47,000 metric tons, drive output of 2.1 standard thrust units, and hull surface composition consistent with Terran military reactive armor, 2.3 meters layered. 47 weapons ports were identified on hull geometry analysis. All ports remain closed as of this transmission. At 7:31, the 7th Enforcement Squadron, 12 vessels, established an interdiction screen on the vessel's approach track. All 12 vessels engaged the contact with weapons fire from a range of 120,000 kilometers. No significant damage was observed on the target hull. The vessel did not return fire. The vessel did not alter course. At approximately 7:39, The 7th Enforcement Squadron dispersed to avoid collision. The vessel continues on its current heading toward the station's central docking zone. At 7:43, I ran a maximum sensitivity long-range passive scan to a range of 2.8 million kilometers. At 2.3 million kilometers, the scan is returning heat and drive emission signatures consistent with approximately 900 vessels in stationary holding formation. The formation has been in place for an estimated 6 to 8 hours. No vessels in the formation are moving. No vessels in the formation are broadcasting on any channel. The IHS Ardent Whisper is not a civilian vessel. It never was. The archive entry is wrong. I do not know how the entry came to be wrong, and I do not know why the vessel has spent 11 months presenting as a civilian contact, and I do not know what 900 vessels at 2.3 million kilometers are waiting for. I know what I know. I know that the archive matched this vessel twice at relay points before it reached us. I know that it passed through our defense screen without returning fire. I know that every weapon on it is still closed, and it is still moving, and the 900 vessels behind it have not moved and have not fired and have not said anything. I know that Commander Vesthal has been trying to reach Fleet Command for the past 37 minutes, and Fleet Command has confirmed receipt of all data and advised us to maintain position and continue observation. I know that maintaining position and continuing observation is exactly the correct institutional response to this situation, and that it is also the response that treats the situation as something the archive can still catch up to, something that will resolve into a classification that already exists, something that the Quorum Exact is prepared for, because we are always prepared, because the archive is complete, because no vessel in the known galaxy travels without being known. I know that the IHS Ardent Whisper is 140,000 kilometers from the station now, and the weapons ports are still closed, and it still has not fired, and I cannot tell you. I am a signals officer, not a tactical analyst, and I will not claim a certainty I do not have. I cannot tell you whether the weapons ports will stay closed. But I can tell you what I think. I think the vessel is not here to destroy the station. I think if it were here to destroy the station, the weapons ports would have opened when we opened fire on it. I think the Ardent Whisper came here the same way it crossed those 2 sensor relays, the same way it flew civilian lanes for 11 months, to arrive, just to arrive. To cross our defense screen and reach our central zone and simply be there, inside everything we built to keep things like it outside, because being there and being unblockable and being undeniable is the message. I think the 900 vessels are still holding at 2.3 million kilometers, because they are not going to advance until the Ardent Whisper has finished delivering the message. I think, and again, I want to be precise about the word think, because I do not have data for what I am about to say. I have an inference, and the Quorum Exact are honest about the difference between data and inference. I think the Terran fleet at 2.3 million kilometers has been there for 6 to 8 hours and has not moved and has not fired and has not transmitted because it has been waiting. Not for us to respond, not for us to flee, not for us to do anything in particular. Waiting, I think, the same way the Ardent Whisper was waiting in civilian lanes for 11 months. Because this was the appropriate time. Because everything before this was them being polite. My scan is updating now. The 900 contacts at 2.3 million kilometers. I'm going to need to correct that number. The scan resolution is improving as the range closes slightly, and what I logged as approximately 900 contacts is resolving into a higher count as the passive array separates hull signatures that were reading as single contacts. Standing by for update. The count as of 7:51 station time is. I need to recalibrate again. The array is no, the array is fine. The array is operating correctly. The returns are correct. There is a protocol for signals officers. who encounter sensor returns that appear incorrect. The protocol says to run the array self-diagnostic, confirm the calibration status, check for environmental interference, and if all of these confirm that the array is functioning correctly and there is no environmental interference, to log the return as a genuine reading, regardless of whether the reading falls outside expected parameters, because the purpose of a sensor array is to tell you what is there, not to tell you what you expected to find. I ran the self-diagnostic. The array is functioning correctly. Calibration is confirmed. There is no environmental interference at this range. I am logging the following as a genuine reading. The contact count at 2.3 million kilometers is approximately 14,000 vessels. The initial count of 900 was the result of multiple hull signatures registering as single contacts at maximum range due to formation density. The vessels in the outer formation are packed closely enough that the passive scan at 2.8 million kilometers was resolving clusters as individuals. As the formation's nearest edge has moved approximately 200,000 kilometers closer in the past 8 minutes, they have begun to advance, slowly, the leading edge of the formation, not the whole of it, just the nearest vessels. The resolution has improved enough to begin separating the clusters. Approximately 14,000 vessels. I sat with that number and tried to find a place for it in the archive and found nothing. The archive's largest single Terran fleet engagement on record involved, depending on the source entry, between 300 and 400 vessels. That engagement had occurred 41 years ago in a sector far from the outer arm, against a civilization that had provoked a response that even the archive described using language that signals officers were not normally encouraged to use in their log notations. 400 vessels. That was the entry. 400. 14,000. I looked at the passive scan display, and at the contact returns building across it, and I thought about the ardent whisper, flying 11 months of civilian lanes at civilian speeds. I thought about how long it takes to assemble 14,000 vessels and move them to the edge of a sector without triggering a single sensor alert at any relay point. And I thought about the skill and the patience that would require, the decades of preparation, the years of polite civilian transit records, the perfect transponder codes and the clean manifests, and the intake officers whose 18-year records would show nothing unusual because everything about what they had filed was, by every instrument we had aimed at it, exactly usual. I thought about what it meant to be capable of all of that, and to choose still, to arrive with the weapons ports closed. I thought about the word polite, and how long you have to be patient to earn the right to use it the way I was now using it, not as a description of behavior, but as a description of restraint, of the deliberate maintenance of a lesser posture when a greater posture is fully available to you. The Quorum Exact built the archive because the archive is safety. What is known cannot surprise you. What is classified is contained. A civilization that has filed everything has, in principle, already survived everything, because you cannot be killed by a thing you have cataloged and accounted for and placed in the correct entry. This is the truth we are built around, the assumption beneath all our other assumptions, the reason that the particular quality of stillness I had watched on Vesthal's face all morning was not simply one officer's uncertainty, but the uncertainty of an entire civilization looking at something it had filed incorrectly and beginning to understand, not yet fully, not all at once, but beginning, that there might be more than one incorrectly filed entry. The ardent whisper is at 120,000 kilometers from the station now. The weapons ports are still closed. The outer formation is at 2.1 million kilometers, advancing slowly. The leading edge continues to separate into individual hull signatures as it closes. The scan count is still resolving upward. 14,000 was the count at 7:53, and the count has continued to climb as formation density separates. And I am no longer trying to finalize the number, because the number is not the point. The number is not the point. The point is the weapons ports. The point is that the Ardent Whisper absorbed everything the 7th Enforcement Squadron had and never opened a single port. The point is that whatever is at 2.1 million kilometers has been sitting in the dark for 6 to 8 hours, in a formation so dense that our best passive array at maximum sensitivity counted it as 900 contacts, and the true count is something that I am not yet able to give you, because the scan is still resolving, and I am a signals officer, and I will not fabricate precision I do not have. The point is that they are still holding fire. The point is 11 months. The point is 2 clean sensor relays. The point is an intake officer with an 18-year record. The point is that everything we know about this encounter was given to us by the people we are looking at, and they gave it to us without being asked. And they gave it to us in the form of a civilian freighter with a clean manifest and a grain shipment, and a suboptimal antenna housing on Deck 4. They told us what we wanted to know, and what we wanted to know was that there was nothing to worry about. I wonder, and I have been using the word wonder all morning, and I want to be honest about how unusual that is for a signals officer, because wonder is not in the log notation vocabulary. It is not a data category. It is not something that maps to an archive entry. I wonder what it is like to be on the Ardent Whisper right now. To be inside that hull in that central zone, surrounded by a station that has been hailing you for 4 hours and 35 minutes, that fired 12 ships worth of weapons at you, that watched you cross every boundary it set. To have all of that happen and to keep the ports closed. I wonder what they are waiting for. I wonder if they are waiting for us to say something. The station's primary power array has just registered an anomalous draw, not from an external source. From the docking zone, the Ardent Whisper's drive signature has changed. It is not decelerating to a stop. It is decelerating to approach speed. And approach speed for a vessel of that mass is still considerably faster than the docking protocols allow. But it is a deceleration, and it is the first change in drive behavior this vessel has made since I began tracking it at 6:14. It is decelerating. I have logged hails to this vessel at regular intervals for 4 hours and 38 minutes. I have received no response on any channel on any band. The weapons ports are still closed. The vessel is decelerating. It is going to stop. And here is what I do not know how to file, what I cannot find an archive entry for, what no intake officer with any record could have prepared a classification to hold. A vessel that spent 11 months in civilian lanes and absorbed the full weapons output of an enforcement squadron without returning fire and crossed every marked boundary and protocol this station has, and is now, in response to nothing I have said, nothing I have done, nothing the station has offered, decelerating. On its own terms, at its own moment, the way something moves when it has chosen the moment not been given it. Politely, the Ardent Whisper is at 90,000 kilometers, drive deceleration holding steady. The outer formation at 2.1 million kilometers continues its slow advance. The leading edge is separating. The scan is still building the count. I am going to stop updating the count and log it as greater than 14,000 and note that the array is still resolving. This is accurate. This is what a signals officer does when the data is still building. She logs what she has and notes that more is coming. More is coming. I am going to continue logging for as long as the station is transmitting. I want to say, to whoever receives this transmission, that I do not believe we are going to be destroyed today. I believe that because the weapons ports are closed, and because no move has been made against us except the move of being here and being undeniable. I believe that because I have been watching the Ardent Whisper for 4 hours and 41 minutes, and in all of that time, through everything we did to it, and everything we said to it, and everything we pointed at it, it has done nothing to us except be present. But I want to be honest about what I don't know. I don't know what the Pale Fleet wants. I don't know what the Ardent Whisper is carrying, other than a hull the archive never held and 47 weapons ports the archive never filed. I don't know what comes after the deceleration, whether there is a hail, a silence, a signal on a band we don't monitor, a conversation that requires one side to have already demonstrated, conclusively and without aggression, that there is no possible outcome to a conflict in which the other side benefits. I know what the Quorum exact has built. I know the archive. I know every relay point and every intake officer and every perfectly maintained classification in every subcategory. I know what it felt like 8 months ago to sit at this station and read a clean file and feel the quiet satisfaction of the known world. I know that the known world has a limit, and I am at it. The Ardent Whisper is at 70,000 kilometers and decelerating. The outer formation is still advancing slowly. The weapons ports are closed. I am Signals Officer Isilvo, Quorum Station 9. This log is transmitted on emergency priority, full sensor data attached, timestamped 7:57 station time. The Pale Fleet is here. It was always here. It was being polite. Log continues. I want to go back to something. I want to go back to the moment at 6:49 when the Ardent Whisper crossed the outer processing waypoint without decelerating, and I want to describe what it looked like on my screen, because I have been so focused on what the numbers meant, and what the archive said that I have not yet said what it looked like, and a signals log is supposed to be complete. It looked like nothing. It looked like a contact trace, a line across the display, moving at a steady heading. On the primary detection screen, which uses a simplified schematic overlay, it was a small marker labeled with its archive designation, a 2-letter alphanumeric followed by a 5-digit identifier. Moving through a grid of approach lanes, the way every contact moves through a grid of approach lanes, following geometry, following physics, indifferent to the labels we had drawn on the space around it. The station's approach zone looks on the schematic display like a series of nested concentric markers: outer processing waypoint, inner approach threshold, primary traffic zone, central docking zone. Each marker is a circle, and the circles are drawn at specific distances from the station, because those distances correspond to the ranges at which a vessel is expected to make specific adjustments, deceleration, bearing changes, formal acknowledgement of docking assignment, in order to arrive in an orderly and predictable way. The circles are lines we drew on space. Space does not know about the circles. The Ardent Whisper crossed each circle the way space crosses all lines drawn on it, without acknowledgement, without deviation, without any sign that the line existed at all. And because I had the archive entry open on the secondary display while I watched the primary display, I watched both at once. The contact trace on the schematic, moving through circles it didn't acknowledge, and the archive entry beside it, perfectly filed, perfectly matched, perfectly describing a vessel that was responding to our circles by doing something that a well-maintained civilian freighter would naturally do when it had antenna and navigation faults on Deck 4. The archive was right. The archive described exactly what the contact was doing. The contact was doing exactly what the archive predicted. This is what perfect classification feels like from the inside. Everything matches, and you don't know the match is wrong, and the comfort you feel is real and earned and entirely misplaced. I think about that now. I think about Seth Sorrell at Karath Hub, 18 years, perfect record, running a sensor check on a vessel that presented civilian transponder codes and civilian drive signatures and civilian hull readings, because it had chosen, on that particular day, at that particular relay point, to present those things. I think about the 2 subsequent relay stations that matched the archive entry without deviation, because the archive entry was correct about everything they were willing to show. I think about 11 months of that. of being a vessel with 47 weapons ports and 2.3 meters of reactive armor and a drive output 5 times the civilian rating, and choosing, for 11 months, to run at civilian speed in civilian lanes with a civilian manifest, filing proper paperwork, appearing in the correct entries, cooperating with the known world. I think about the patience that requires and what it means to have it. The quorum exact has a concept. It does not translate simply into the common tongue, but the closest approximation is considered forbearance, the deliberate maintenance of a lesser expression of capability as a form of respect toward those who cannot yet process the greater one. It is something that senior administrators practice toward junior officials, something that experienced intake officers practice toward new hires, something that the archive itself practices toward the species it catalogs, giving them the understanding they can use, rather than the understanding that would simply overwhelm. We have this concept. We do not often have occasion to find ourselves on the receiving end of it. The ardent whisper is at 60,000 kilometers. The drive deceleration is steady. It is going to stop in the central docking zone. I don't know what happens when it stops. I don't know whether a hailing frequency will open, whether a crew member will address the station, whether something will be transmitted or requested or simply demonstrated by the fact of being here and being stopped and being present. I don't know if what is behind it, the outer formation that the passive scan is still resolving, the count that has gone past 14,000 and is still climbing as the density separates into individual signatures. I don't know if that formation will continue to advance after the ardent whisper stops, or whether it will hold where it is, being patient, being quiet, maintaining the lesser posture while the message finishes being delivered. I have been transmitting this log for approximately 9 minutes. In those 9 minutes, Commander Vesthal has received 3 confirmations from Fleet Command that the transmissions are being received and that Fleet Command is. And I want to log this precisely because the exact phrasing matters. Fleet Command is convening an emergency session of the Administrative Council, which means that the people who are authorized to do something about this situation are now in a room discussing what to do about this situation. And in the meantime, the ardent whisper is decelerating in our central docking zone, and the outer formation is advancing, and I am at my station watching my screen and logging what I see. This is the quorum exact in an emergency. We convene sessions, we log data, we make the record complete. And while we are making the record complete, the thing we are making the record about is continuing to happen, at its own pace, on its own terms, without reference to whether the session has been convened or the log has been timestamped. The archive cannot be assembled faster than what is being assembled at 2.1 million kilometers. The log cannot be filed faster than what is crossing our docking zone. I know this. I am 23 years old and I have been a signals officer for 2 tours, and I know this the way I know the mass profile anomaly and the drive signature discrepancy and the 47 weapons ports, not because the archive told me, but because I am sitting here watching it. Let me say something about the weapons ports one more time, because I don't think I have said it clearly enough in this transmission, and I want the record to be clear. The 7th Enforcement Squadron fired on the Ardent Whisper for approximately 8 minutes at close range with 12 vessels worth of weapons output. During those 8 minutes, the Ardent Whisper's drive did not change. Its heading did not change. Its hull integrity did not change, and its weapons ports did not change. The ports were closed when the 7th opened fire. They were closed when the 7th dispersed. They were closed when the vessel crossed into the central zone. They were closed 9 minutes ago when I began this transmission, and they are closed now, at 8:06 station time, as the drive signature transitions from deceleration to station keeping, and the vessel completes its approach to the central docking zone. A vessel with 47 weapons ports held them closed through 12 ships firing at it. I want to be very careful about what I say next, because I am a signals officer and not a diplomat and not an analyst and not a member of the administrative council that is currently in emergency session. But the record should contain my observation, logged clearly as an observation and not as policy or instruction. A vessel that will not fire back, even when fired upon, is not a vessel that has been sent to destroy you. The ardent whisper has stopped. It is at rest in the central docking zone of Quorum Station 9, occupying a volume of space that was designed for vessels roughly a third its mass, and it is simply there, and the outer formation at approximately 2 million kilometers has also slowed its advance, and for the first time since 6:14 this morning, nothing on my screen is moving. The station is still transmitting, my array is still active, the log is current. I have been watching this contact for 4 hours and 52 minutes. I sent the first hail at 6:14. I am sending another one now, on every available band as a formality, because the archive says you send hails to vessels in your docking zone, and I am a signals officer and I follow protocol, and the protocol exists whether or not the vessel is going to respond. I do not know whether it will respond. But I know this. There are somewhere between 14,000 and the scan is still resolving, more than 14,000 Terran vessels at 2 million kilometers. They arrived in the dark while the station slept. They held position for 6 to 8 hours while a single vessel ran the 11 months of civilian lanes required to get here. They watched the 7th Enforcement Squadron fire on that vessel, and they did not move. They began their slow advance only after the enforcement action was complete and the docking zone was quiet. They were polite about the whole thing. That is my observation, logged at 8:07 station time, Quorum Station 9, Signals Officer Isilvo, second tour. The Pale Fleet is in our docking zone and at our threshold, and it came a very long way, very carefully, over a very long time, holding fire at every step. I think they have something to say. I think we should find out what it is. Log continues.